When I walk into the classroom is everybody's sitting in the back of the class and they say, this class is over until everybody comes up front. So move up front, come on, let's move. All the way up front. There's no need for us to be shouting. I don't need to project my voice. Come on now, everybody up front. Yep, front row, all the way up. I'm the professor. Professor Neilson says you come up to the front, and then if you were in my class, you'd have an assigned seat, so my Alzheimer's-addled brain would be able to remember who you were, because you'd always be in the same place. But okay. First, a little bit about me, so you know who's talking. I have many hats. This teaching, being a professor at DU kind of came to me through the back channel because I was on the Industrial Advisory Board of the Electrical Engineering Department, and they were looking to it's a stated goal of the university from the chancellor on down, to become more entrepreneurial. And the business school has a whole group of entrepreneurial people and are working on their presence in the entrepreneurial space. But the engineering school, which is the natural place to even be more entrepreneurial, had nothing. So we proposed to the ABET, which is the American Board for Engineering Technology, or whatever it is, the accreditation board, that we would start a course called Engineering Entrepreneurship that would be a required course for the electrical engineers. And it's currently a required course in about 4 different engineering programs throughout the country. It's a new thing for the kids to do this. So this will be my 4th year teaching it, and I got roped into it because after we got the course approved, all the professors are looking around, well, we don't know anything about entrepreneurship. Who are we going to get to teach it? And they looked to the advisory board, and especially since I was fairly active in getting the course approved, and Paul, what about you? And so I ended up teaching it. My other 2 hats that I currently wear is I'm currently an entrepreneur myself, working on turning a very small force sensor. We can measure femtograms of force into various sensor types. Femtogram is 14 zeros and a 1 after the decimal point of grams. It's a very tiny amount of stuff. On our scale, if you think of it as a platform, if I put 1 water molecule, enough to cover 5% of the surface area, I can actually measure the mass of that in the gravitational field. So we can measure a whole lot of nothing, is the way I would tell people. In addition, prior to that, I had done what you guys are trying to do. I had invented some stuff. I had got some patents. I built a company. It was bootstrapped. We started with no money. I didn't know anything about finance at the time. We bootstrapped it up, got to about 125 employees after 25 years. And I went out and I tried to sell it, and that's when I learned a few lessons that I'm going to talk about here. I ended up selling it to one of the few suitors I had, which was a company in Australia that bought my company along with 7 other companies to roll them together into one company that they then flipped to Schneider Electric. They took home, rolling that together, they made about $160 million on buying these companies and putting it together. That was the premium Schneider was willing to pay to have somebody do that work for them rather than need to buy them all individually themselves. In addition to that, I'm very active in the RVC with investing. When I sold my company, I finally got some cash, and I've started doing some investing, so I've funded 6 different startups in the last couple of years, and currently working as the lead investor for one company that is making a medical device for which we've put together so far 34 interested investors into this company. And So of course now, having done it, I think I can talk a little bit better. I hadn't done this last year when I had this subject, but having actually put together a large group of investors where we're now negotiating it, doing the due diligence and negotiating a term sheet, a lot of things become clearer to you. I was going to start out and just give the same speech I gave to the at Loveland at their entrepreneurship program up there in the fall. It seemed to be pretty well received, but I've learned a few things since then, and there's a few points I wanted to go over prior to kicking off that speech. And one of them is to try to quantify for you how much money is out there. Last year, 2014, a little over $40 billion was invested in startups. Of that, about $30 billion came from the standard venture capitalists, the guys who would go out and raise a fund, put it together, and then invest in various companies. The average investment for a VC is up in the $6 million area. So if you aren't looking for $6 million, they aren't interested in talking to you, okay? But another thing has happened, and it's happening increasingly, and the RVC is one of the groups that's doing it, the Rockies Venture Club, is about a quarter of that $40 billion came from angel investors. And they fund a lot smaller tranches, although they are moving up too, just like the VCs are, so that the average angel investment was on the order of $800,000 to $1 million into a company. That is the pool of money that's out there. It's growing fast. The VCs had been in bad shape until the last couple of years. And so it grew 25% last year, the pool of money that's available. It works out total, there were about 6,000 deals last year where startups got funded in the entrepreneurial type companies, okay? About 3,000 of those were deals by VCs. So it kind of gives you a feel for how the money's different. The VCs are putting in 3/4 of the money, but only on half the deals. Angels are putting in 1/4 of the money, but on half the deals. And the normal path, the normal expected path, is that the angels are putting in enough money to get you to the point where you can then go to a venture capitalist and get a Series A round. So the first part is to get to enough traction, because as I'm being told today, VCs are not really looking at companies to fund until they already have enough traction that they might have $1 million in revenue. You need to be at $1 million run rate to get that $6 million investment, where the angels are also looking for you to have some traction. And so the number of points you have to get to it's smaller. It's easier to get angel financing. They're more approachable, easier to talk to. For the flip side of this, especially as I look around the room, I'll give you the story I got from a local angel capitalist, local venture capitalist, which is David Gold at Access Venture Partners. And a little over 2 years ago, I was in a meeting with him and a number of other angels as we were talking to a company that was looking for investment. And I had been, one of the companies I had funded, I was the lead investor on, was a guy about my age. I'm 62 now, so it was back then. He and I were both about 60. And at the signing, I took him out to lunch at the Cherry Creek Grill when I was passing my check. And I asked him, what do you think was the biggest problem you had in raising money? Because I knew he'd been at it for a year. And he had pitched the company at least 60 times to various groups. And I asked him, what was the biggest problem? He came back, the biggest problem was, I'm too old. I heard, what? This can't be true. This is America. It's not legal. My first response, I'm too old. So I had this opportunity a few months later while I have a VC in the room with a $70 million fund. He makes average investments around $3 million. And I asked him, retold the story of how this guy got funded, and was he in fact too old? And then before he's looking around, and then, am I too old? And I asked that question, am I too old? And usually I judge the sincerity of an answer by how little time the response takes. If the answer comes back in 10 milliseconds, I know I got the truth. The answer came back in 10 milliseconds, yes, you're too old. So I listened to that, and I'm like, no, this can't be true. I went through all the stages of grief, because I'm out there trying to get my own next business started. And I didn't believe him. I went around and I asked other people. I even asked his partners. They were a little more politically correct. They said, no, you're not too old. However, we'll have lots of questions about your stamina and your motivation. Well, frankly, I've sold out of one company, and at this age, I'm not all that motivated. Yes, I did work yesterday. It was Sunday, so I can't be like I'm not motivated, but still, I'm not as motivated as I was when I was 30. And as for stamina, forget about it. If I need a nap in the afternoon, I take one now. So I recently was talking to, I've brought in some people. I've got 7 people working for me now. Average age is 23. So I've got a big generation gap between me and them. They're all ex-DU students, although I have one student from Mines. 4 of them have taken my class. I use my teaching as a way to identify the appropriate suspects to hire. I've done this before in my previous company. When I was in Massachusetts, we would bring in WPI interns, and it worked out great. Bringing in an intern and finding out for cheap whether they're going to work out or not works great, so I recommend it to anybody. So I decided at the time I had an engineering professor, was my vice president, so he knew all the students anyways. He was my vice president of engineering, so he was bringing them in. This time around I thought, well, I better go find some, so that's another reason why I took the job at DU. Well, one of them happens to be my son. You worry about nepotism. However, my son's been going to some of the RVC meetings, and all of the various investors have met him. And Praful Shah, who's one of the thought leaders in the RVC, comes up to me back in November, having met my son, and he shakes my hand and he says, wow, what a kid. Huh? What? Oh, I met your son yesterday. Oh, and then he tells me, you know, you're too old. I wouldn't invest in you, but I'd invest in him. So I then was sitting in a meeting the other day with a bunch of entrepreneurs, and this woman is making a wearable, one of these fitness wearable things, and she's already got the product. She's already selling several thousand pieces a month. You know, she's got traction, but not really getting enough traction to make the leap and she just made the rounds of the venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. And she had decided that it was time to move out of Silicon Valley, and she'd moved to Denver. Huh? Why'd you do that? Well, because I made the rounds in Silicon Valley, and they all had the same thing to tell me. They all told me I'm too old. And I'm looking at her, and how old are you? And she says, 42. Peter Thiel is on record, funder of Netscape and all of these other things, is on record as saying 35 is the oldest I'll look at. Okay, so if you're going the VC route, you got to look in the mirror and decide who is your CEO. Well, I've turned my son into the CEO. You want the public face of my company now, it's my son. Yeah, he's 24. Yep, he's exactly what they want. And I'm exactly what they want to because I'm chairman of the board. So what do they have? They have the tired, old, unmotivated, gray-haired guy who's done it all and made every mistake possible at least 3 times. And so they have the experience, but they also have the stamina and the motivation they're looking for in the youngster. So if you're talking to venture capitalists, keep this in mind. There is real ageism, and the golden rule works for venture capitalists, which is those who have the gold make the rules. So there's no arguing with them. I gave up. I stopped fighting. When you go to angels, it's another story altogether. You go to the angel investors, well, they're all older than me or my age. Age is not a problem. So if you're looking to get started, the angel route for a lot of you, as I look around the room, is a lot more appropriate than the venture capitalist route. So you see how the money breaks down. You see how the cruelties of age break down. These are real things. There's real money out there. It can be had. There's this the company I was telling you about that was too old to get funded, he did his second round just in the fall. It took him a month to line up $2 million out of the same group of angels. He's got tons of traction. He's on his way, okay? He's up to 18 people now in the startup. Okay, so what do you need to do if you're looking for funding? The first thing you need to do is to give yourself enough time. It's not something you can do quickly. I started in with the RVC over 2.5 years ago, knowing I was going to be looking for funding. I still haven't pitched yet. I haven't asked anybody for $1. I'll get to you later why I haven't done that, but I have not pitched to them. You need to start meeting the angels and the venture capitalists at least a year before you ask any of them for funding. If they don't have some level of knowledge of you, the likelihood of them writing a check is very small. And it takes 6 months to a year for them to get that comfort feeling, much like you would with making a friend or anything else. You know, they're going to go on the first date, okay, but they aren't writing the check till a year goes by. So if you don't start talking to them a year before you need the money, you're going to be in trouble. Entrepreneurship is a social sport. It's a contact sport, by the way, but it's a social sport. You need to go to lots of events where you will meet funders. I've been making this point to Peter Adams at RVC recently. He's recently made the point to a bunch of entrepreneurs. You need to look at a lot of pitches. If you see other people do it, you will know what works and what doesn't work. If you're going to the RVC conference next week, you can see 20 pitches in 2 days. You'll find out who gets traction, who doesn't get traction. What you won't get is the experience of going to the investor meeting afterwards. If you go to the investor meeting afterwards, you really find out who did well on their pitch or who laid an egg and isn't getting any traction whatsoever. So, and it's surprising who gets traction and who doesn't. It takes multiple contacts to establish trust with an angel. There are a number of companies that I first met them the day they pitched, and maybe 6 months, maybe 9 months later, I wrote them a check. It took me that long to get to the comfort level. I went to multiple presentations. I listened to them pitch 4 or 5 times before I finally understand what you're talking about. I get it. I've established their bona fides. Are they good people? All that kind of stuff. How long, once you start presenting, how long will it take to get funding? The company I talked about, which was their second time around getting funding, they got their $2 million in a couple months after the start of pitching for the money. But figure it's 2 to 6 months, but it's probably closer to 6 months, especially if it's your first time through. You need to leave yourself enough runway to raise the money. People will be looking at you very critically in the due diligence period. Are you out of money today? Because you aren't getting money for 6 months. So you better not be out of money today. And if you are, you probably aren't a good candidate to be funded because you're not experienced enough of a CEO to know that it's going to take 6 months. So it's a big negative to run out of runway, to go up and say to somebody, I need the money now because I'm out of runway. When you need money, you'll never get it. You're going to get money when you don't need it, okay? It's just the way it's the same thing. It's the same thing. Angels are perpetually short of time. Most of them, like me, I've got 2 other jobs. One's a startup. Plus, I'm looking at all these companies. I don't have enough time to really give you my full attention. In most cases, it's their hobby, not their vocation. There are a few of us that are retired and doing it full time, and that's all they do is angel investing. But most of us have a real job too, and do the angel investing on the side. You have to remember to never waste their time. You have to compete to get their attention. It takes time to get their attention because they're busy. And so you can't, but on the flip side, if they call you for a question, you better have an answer back to them within 24 hours. They'll give you the 24 hours, but again, that's a test for you as CEO. If I give you a question you can't answer in 24 hours, you flunked your CEO job. And I really don't care if you are on vacation in Aruba. You better answer me the question, okay? You have to remember to not get in the way of their other things in their life. You have to work with them. But they're not bad people. All of them are normal, very approachable people. You should never be afraid to go talk to one. You should never worry about a wart or a problem you're having. If you got a problem, talk to them about how you solve the problem, not cover it up. And so I've got this startup plan and I've got a problem with it. What do I do? Well, my startup plan was I'm too old. What do I do? They told me, hire your son after they met him. Put him in the job. Okay, ask him a question. I was forthright with it. I'm too old. Everybody says so. When are you ready to begin the fundraising process? This is a harder question to answer because it changes all the time. It's somewhat dependent on the external world. And so you have to look, if everything has just gone into a deep recession, it's probably a bad time to be asking for money. It's not going to be easy. If we're starting to get big employment and there's not a boom going on, but at least people are getting hired again, okay, that's a good time. And we see it. The amount of the pool of money has grown 25% in the last year. This is a good time. But these periods can last for multiple years. So you need to be careful. Are you getting there in the right time? Today, in general, you need to have your product or service in the marketplace before you'll get any attention. It's not an absolute rule. When I say in general, if you ask me the percentage, well, it's more than 50. It's less than 75. Exactly where it is, I don't know. Especially if you're doing something like a web startup, because the web startups are perceived to be something you can get on the marketplace really quickly by all the investors. And if you don't have paid customers, you're not ready. It's too soon. It's too soon. You're not ready. If you're building mechanical things or if you're doing something more complex, it might take longer, might take more money. You might get money earlier in the process, but again, they're looking for you to be fairly far along. With my own product, I did go out and talk to the VCs, and I told them where I was in the development, and I remember I was in a bar in Boulder, and I was talking to this guy, and usually I do pretty good at a bar when I've got a couple martinis into the financier. Maybe he'll talk to me nice. And this guy laughed at me when I told him at the point I was at. Am I ready for money? He laughed at me. And he then told me what I needed to do to get there, and I was light years away from being ready. But it changes with time. How do you get to this point without funding? Friends, family, and your own investment. generally how people do it. There is another way, though. In my current startup, the base technology I'm furthering, this small force sensor, was developed at DU with $4 million in grants from the federal government to get to the point where they had a working tech in the lab. They had one piece that worked. Since then, I've applied to the SBIR, Small Business Innovative Research Program, at the National Science Foundation, and I've just landed my third phase 1. I've got 2 phase 2s that I'm currently in process with. So I've raised $2 million more federal money for my project. I have runway that lasts past the end of this year, into next year, into maybe the end of next year. But I also have a phase 2 that we'll be applying for another use of this sensor. It would give me another $750,000, would get me through another year and a half, 2 years. So I'm in a situation where a combination of experience and a professor and a guy who knows how to write grants and this and that and the other thing. And yeah, I've applied for 5, 6, 8 grants, and I've been awarded 7 of them. Most people don't have that kind of a track record. There's a way to go about it. I can tell you if you've got a chance or not. It's not the easiest thing to do. When you're talking to your company, when you're talking to investors about your company, most of the time I hear people start their pitch and continue their pitch and drone on their pitch and continue it some more and keep going about the product. But I'm not buying your product. I'm buying stock in your company. I want to hear something entirely different. For me, the product is maybe 30% of what I'm listening to. Okay? And so you've always got to remember that the investor is buying a part of your company. You don't just talk about what you're doing for your customers. You talk about why you're building a great company for the investor. Okay? And this mistake's made all the time. I've listened to literally hundreds of pitches where they never, they might have given me a minute about who's on the team and how experienced they are, but all the rest of the pitch was about the product. I'm not investing in them. They don't know what they're selling. If you don't know what you're selling, why should I invest in you? You don't know enough to be the CEO. You're selling your company, not your product. When you're talking to an investor, it's just like you're selling your product, though, in one way. You're qualifying a sales lead. It's no different. And there are plenty of investors that invest in only certain type products. I know investors that will only invest in medical devices. I know other investors that wouldn't touch a medical device, period, ever. You have to, so the first thing you need to do is, after a quick explanation of your product, is ask a question. Is this the kind of thing you like to invest in? If the answer is no, you've just qualified this guy or woman. They're not a sales lead. Go on to the next one. You've got to qualify your lead. You've got a limited amount of time. You've got to put it to the best possible use. Find out what they're interested in. If they're not interested in your stuff, you're not going to convert them. They're just not interested. Go find someone who is interested in what you're doing. Another thing that they're going to look at is the size of your deal and the stage of your development. Size of your deal and stage of development. You need to qualify that. There are a group of angels who want to invest in smaller deals. Companies that won't be looking for another round of investment. They're afraid that when the venture capital pros get in, they aren't experienced enough and they'll get taken to the cleaners by the VCs and they don't want to invest in that. And then there's a whole different group of angels who, that's the only company they would invest in. So you've got to qualify what's the size of the deal? What's your stage of development? Do you have working prototype? Do you have customers? Where are you? Do you have a patent? Most, and then you come to the biggest lie of all, and it's even bigger than I thought, as I've found out from recent research. Most investors, angels and venture capitalists will tell you that as you're selling your company to them, it's all about team. We're interested in your team. Who's on your team? Couldn't be further from the truth. That is not their number one priority. The first thing they are trying to find out about is the size of the market. The size of the market defines everything. If I know the market size, I can tell you the path for your deal going forward. If I don't know the size of the market, I don't know anything. I don't know what your path is. You're wasting my time. Don't waste my time. Tell me what the size of your deal is. The size of your deal is, what's the size of your market? What's the size of your market in real terms? I see endless slides and pitches where people put up and say, the sports equipment market is $18 billion a year in the US, and we're going to make the best waterproof match holder. Well, it's not the size of your market. The size of your market is waterproof match holders. That's what I'm looking for. And if you do that, I'm done. I'm not paying any more attention to you ever. Because basically, the first thing we're looking for is, I'm going to see so many potential deals. I'm just looking for reasons to cross you off my list. The first mistake is you're off my list. I'm going to see over 200 deals. I'm going to invest in 3. Okay? And I'm going to see 200 of them. And I'll tell you, in the first 30 seconds of the pitch, half of them are written off. Okay? But that's me. There's another guy over here sitting next to me who's listening to your pitch. He's a different guy, and that's the kind of thing he's looking for. And okay, but all of us are the same thing. If you make an egregious mistake in your pitch, you're written off. And pitching the wrong size market, not giving us real market numbers, is a huge red flag. But that's what we're looking at, is the size of the market. It's first you get the total addressable market, then you get the serviceable addressable market, and then you get to some magic numbers. If your total addressable market is below $1 billion, the venture capitalists aren't interested. They don't want to talk to you. They'll be nice and send you on somewhere else. And they may even tell you that if you do this, they'll talk to you some more. If you're below $1 billion total addressable market, there's no need to go to the VCs. It's not a VC deal. It's an angel deal. I went up to VCs, and when I had the first piece of product I was looking at in my company was a $200 million market, and I started total addressable market, real numbers. I could go buy a market research paper that would tell you it's $200 million. No, not interested. Why? How do I know this? I asked the question point blank. How big does the market need to be for you to be interested? This is with a mid-sized fund. This is with a $70 million fund in town. They need $1 billion market. If you're talking to some of the big tier 1 firms on the coast, they're looking for a multi-billion dollar market, or they're not interested. You can't grow large enough to employ the amount of money they have to use. Remember, it's just numbers. It's nothing personal. They have investors that they're reporting to. They have to find a deal that works for them. Well, there's angels of all kinds out there, and you can find the angel that's out there for you. You may have to look for a while. You may have to look for a long time, but there are angels out there who will take your size deal. Remember always that the initial investors want at least a 10x return. 10x return. They're looking for a 70% interest rate on the money they give you. Okay, a venture investor is looking for a 70% return. It's not like using your credit card. It's like using 4 credit cards to pay your credit card interest. Okay, that's the number they're looking for. I would have said a higher number a year ago. That number's come down. That number's always in flux. It depends on how many deals there are versus how much money is out there. There's 25% more money. Okay, that number's come down. I would have told you a year ago, they're looking for 15 times their money back. Now it's 10. It's come down again. 5 years, 5 to 8. Angels will typically go a little bit longer in time frames because they're typically an earlier stage investor. So they know they're investing you earlier in the timeline. So they'll go for a longer period of time. VCs are typically getting you later in the timeline. They want less time to do that. But everybody is looking, there's a new trend now called early exits, where you get the company up to where you actually have product on the marketplace and it looks great. And rather than waiting for you to fully grow, the company will step in and buy you earlier, trying to pay a lower price while taking on the market risk, figuring that their sales force can do a better job than you can. It's a trend these days. There's a lot of these things are just like women's fashions. It's going to be different this year from that year to the next year, and it's going to roll around again and be back to the same thing it was 5 years ago. There's no fixed pattern. You have to know where you are today. The other big deal is the size of the exit. This is a huge deal for everyone. It's something I did not understand when I was selling my company. The size of the exit matters a lot, and I've talked to VCs in town exactly about this. A public company, a large public company, is not doing any deal for an exit. They're not buying you. If the deal is less than $60 million today, they aren't buying you, period. They're not looking at you. You're too small. Okay? Well, there's a magic number there. That 60 million is a magic number. If you're not worth 60 million, you're worth a whole lot less than 60 million. The large public company multiples will be 20 times your EBIT going forwards. But if you're not being bought by a public company, you're being bought by a financial investor. I use the words, well, if you're being bought by a financial investor, you might get 4 to 8 times EBIT back. Well, Peter Adams contradicted me the other day when I said this in a group of, and he said, no, it's more like 2 to 6 times EBIT. EBIT being earnings before interest and taxes. Not EBITDA, I don't ever use the da part. That's back in the year 2000, funnily and stuff. So if you're not looking at a 60 million deal, you're looking at a $20 million deal for $1 less in sales or in EBIT. It's a huge gap between those two. Investors know this. You need to know it because that's how we're going to factor in our numbers. It's a huge gap between those two. Once the size of the exit is estimated, I can in about 30 seconds, I can do all the rest of the counts in my head now. I've seen enough deals. Once I know what the size of your exit is, I can tell you what you're worth pretty quickly and using a bunch of rules of thumbs. When we do due diligence on a deal now, we have 5 different valuation methods we use. The 5 different valuation methods will turn up a range of values depending on your particular deal that might vary by a factor of 50% to a factor of 2 in valuing your company today. You can find out what these are, do the math yourself. It's not that hard. I like to use the risk stairs method, but it's a lot harder to do because what you're trying to do is take the various risks at the number of stages. And basically, if you get into a company that has more than 6 major risks, don't even talk about it because there's too much risk. The probability of success is too low. There are other methods. There's the method, take the number of engineers and multiply by 1 million. Gets used. It comes out surprisingly well most of the time. There are many methods that you can use to value a startup. Find out what they are and value yourself. You don't want to go into your negotiation blind. You want to know how other people are going to look at you. And then again, in your pitch, cover why your company is more special, not so much why your product is more special. There'll be plenty of time. If we get to due diligence, there'll be plenty of time. Remember, when you're making your pitch, all you're doing is basically going on a blind date. You're trying to get your first real date. Your pitch is a blind date. Okay, if you get another phone call, that's your first real date. If it gets serious, you're going to have 2 weeks of solid dating. Okay, but that's about the way it goes. Your pitch is just that, blind date. Team, the other piece that people evaluate, team. Team is by definition not one person. If you go to an angel group looking for funding and you are one person, it's really tough. Because the first question that anybody's going to ask is the proverbial bus question: what happens to my money when the bus hits you? Okay, it's a proverbial bus question. You'll get asked that. One person is not a team. Two people can be a team. Two people can be a team. One is not a team. While a complete team is desirable, an incomplete team is easily dealt with at the pitch stage, especially if you're smart about it and you say, right up front, I need a marketing and sales guy. Do you know any? To the investor. They love that. Oh, now they're being given a chance to do what they can do, which is pull out their, I would in the old days say Rolodex, but today they'd pull out their cell phone and look up their contact list because they know somebody who's looking for a job who's probably right the kind of person you need. So don't be bashful for asking for team members. That's the one thing the investors can do for you. Startup experience makes it easier to get financed. That's a true statement. Makes it easier to get financed. If you've done it before, when you get evaluated by the people evaluating team, they say, it's not your first rodeo. There's less things to go wrong. You know already what's going to go wrong, even if you failed your first time around. Don't let it bother you a bit if you don't have that, because most funded entrepreneurs are first-timers. But be sure you are coachable, and be sure that you showed you were coachable to the investor during the investor meetings. If you're coachable, we can get past a lot of problems. If you're not coachable, the first time a problem comes up, we know we're going to fail. Be coachable. However, there is some new research out that shows of the two phases, the first phase, you're just trying to get funded. That just gets you, that's just the price of admission into the game. That's just the ante to get to play the game. Success in the game is a different deal altogether. As it turns out, success in getting funding is often team experience is valuable, and I've seen teams that have, got a guy who's working on his third or fourth company gets funded easily, precisely because it's his third or fourth company. I looked at his idea and I go, I don't understand this idea at all. Why are we funding him? And he got funded anyhow. But the research says that in terms of market success for companies, successful exits for companies, which is what we're all looking for, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, is only 12% team. It's much more than 50% is the market, size of the market. Do you know your market? How's your market research been? Okay, market is, so this is new. I've tested this out on the professor of entrepreneurship he's the head of entrepreneurship in the Daniels Business School. I saw him last week. I tested out this new research on him. Do you believe it? He says, no, that's bullshit. All I can tell you is the conventional wisdom is that team matters a lot. The new one written report, getting data on startups is not so easy. The new written report on success of exits is Team doesn't matter much. A good market matters a lot. And what it's really saying is if you don't know your way around, but you do get funded, you'll figure your way through it. You'll figure out what you're doing wrong and self-correct. How are we doing for time, Roger? Am I?
We're right in an hour, but you can.
Well, I'll hurry up. I've got two last things here. Test your pitch early and often. I've been testing my pitch for the last 2 years. I have a difficult story to sell. I'm making a platform technology. I've got this sensor that measures really tiny amounts of nothing. And it gets applied in all kinds of different markets. I'm going from life sciences to petroleum engineering to, we've got our third contract is to build an atomic force microscope with it. It covers so many things, there's no way I can pitch it. I've tried to figure out how do I pitch a platform company, and so far, over 2 years, I failed. Now, if you want me to pitch one of the three, I can do a really good job of our 3 products we're working on. I can pitch the product really nicely, but if I try to pitch all 3 of them, it's tough. So we recently applied for an Advanced Industries Colorado grant for $160,000, where we pitched one of the products with a little, off in the far distance, a background that we're a platform company. But we were pitching the one product. If you noticed here, no PowerPoints, no handouts, no nothing. I'm dying to see somebody get up in the RVC and give a pitch without a PowerPoint. I may be the one to try it. PowerPoints make my eyes bleed. Okay, I've seen so many of them. You know, you can have all the slick graphics in the world. I could care less. All that means is, oh, you're good with colors. That's nice. You must have been hell at finger painting. It doesn't tell me anything about you or your company or this. If you can't explain why you're special very quickly, you aren't special. You need to be able to tell me why you're special very quickly. That's my problem in trying to talk about my platform. I can't do it. So I don't. I alter my pitch. I tell you about my one product. What's my one product? I haven't talked about it at all tonight. We make a product that can detect very small particles that are very bad for your health. We're going to sell that to you as an individual thing we're trying to make between consumer grade up to full industrial grade for use. People get silicosis still. There's about 2 million people at risk in the US. The federal government would require all 2 million of them to wear our monitor if that monitor was cost effective. What's cost effective? I don't know, 300 bucks, you ask. 300 bucks times 2 million. I'll take that business. I don't need to say to any of the investors any more than that. The federal government would require all 2 million workers to wear it. The first question they're going to ask me, I'll leave that open for them during my pitch. The first question they're going to ask me, how much are you going to sell it for? Well, the current one that is on the market today goes for 28 grand for a single user, and so nobody will use it. And we're thinking somewhere between $500 and $1,000 to start a year as a service contract. That's the one we pitched to the Colorado Advanced Industries. I've had the guy who developed the NIOSH rules has been in my office talking to me about why they developed the rules, how, thought enough of what we were doing to come visit us on his own dime rather than us going to visit him. Will they do it? Yes. I've had numerous calls of people finding out by looking through the SBIR grants that we actually got this grant. Can you help us? We need something. And there's still hundreds to thousands of people a year dying from silicosis and black lung. So, okay, that's what we're doing. But it turns out worse. There's a new paper out showing that lung function in kids in Southern California has gone up by 15% over the last 10 years as the air pollution small particles went down. And no one's got this machine in the first place to even measure the particles, to find out what the smallest particles are doing to you. And I would then tell you, if we were talking this long, because I got you interested with my initial pitch, that the worst occupational health anywhere is firemen. No one knows why. There's a big belief that perhaps it's the very small toxic nanoparticles that cross right between the blood, cross right through into your bloodstream in your lungs. They're so small, they go right through your blood vessels and into your lungs, into your bloodstream. No one has the instrument to test this. We do. That's another 1 million users. And that would be covered under union contract, because I'm sure the very first thing, once the firefighters find out that there's a problem with this, and even though the air is clear, there's no smoke, the toxic nanoparticle load is so heavy that I could have an acute event which would give me a heart attack in the next 3 days. More speculative, time to go, but those are the kind of things you're looking to pitch your market. Test your pitch early, often. Test your pitch, talk to everybody, test it. Find out what works, ask them if they liked it, ask them if they understand it, modify it, change it. This company I'm the lead investor on has pitched 4 times in front of the RVC groups. Different groups now, because there's groups up in the Springs and in Boulder and all around. And each time he's pitched, the pitch has gotten markedly better. By the 4th time he pitched it in the front of the room, it was an excellent pitch. It was just top notch. Practice, practice, practice. Have your due diligence ready before you start pitching. Due diligence file is about 60 pages of stuff. RVC has a checklist. If you pitch and you start to get traction and you don't have your due diligence material ready, you'll lose the momentum you've built. And a deal is a momentum play. Getting your financing is momentum. Once you get that momentum, you let it slip, it becomes what we would call a stale deal. It's very rare that a stale deal becomes unstale and actually gets funded. You have to do a whole lot of extra work to get the deal off the stale list. You need all your due diligence ready before you even start to pitch. Final point, early investors, your best friend. Real entrepreneurship is not the Shark Tank. Everything you see in the Shark Tank is made for TV nonsense. We aren't going to do anything like that at all. The early investor is always trying to maximize his return. The risks are always huge. You are not the enemy. You're the guy who's going to take his money and get him big returns. There is no adversarial relationship between you and the investor. They're your friend. They're going to try to help you figure out how to get forward. You need to listen to them. You need to talk to lots of them. If the going gets tough, they're going to be the best help you can find, because it's their money. They want you to succeed. So, but if you start making secrets and hiding things and you lose the trust of your investors, you're done. It won't work. Knowledge is often brought to the startup by the investor, and in the trade we would call that smart money. If you can get smart money because your investors have knowledge in what you're doing, they can be worth way more than a lot of service providers. Oops, did I say that? And that's it. That covers my talk there.
Okay, why don't we just take a 10-minute break and we can come back for Q&A? Don't mind staying for some Q&A.
I'm not going anywhere.
Great. You know, the market
That's for the standard investor.
Yeah.
The standard investor. The venture investor, you've got to have the growth. It's got to be there. That's what it's a venture investor. Different investors. Are there angels for slow growth companies? Absolutely. There are. There are all kinds of people with all kinds of needs, and sure, if you go to the RVC, you're not going to find them. Because they're all growth angels, as opposed to, if you go to the impact angels, which is now, I forget what the name is.
That's
shut that
people that
down.
invest in certain, say, fields and technologies, and they're not that concerned
Do
about.
good. To do good,
Right.
yes. So my particle device has a great pitch for these angel investors. That is the impact angel. Because we're going to save lives. We're doing good, and we're also going to make it.
You're measuring like this ultra microscopic.
Particles going to kill you. Yeah.
Even out the weather cooperating. Got pitch coaching again, so.
I pitch coach too. I pitch coached the guy I pitched with the back neck pain through the website that nobody would even talk to.
Oh, was that the one from last November?
Yeah,
Okay.
that guy got zero. It was basically laughed out from the investors. And the other guy I pitched was Jim Kasich at One.
Oh, well, that guy was a shoe-in.
He's got more. He's the one. That's the one I'm doing.
Because, yeah, he's on his fourth or
Well,
fifth.
he did what I told everybody he should do. He found me long before he went to start the pitch to involve me on the advisory board to get, and so we worked back and forth for months already.
Yeah, that was a good fit for you, because he's kind of in that micro
He
instrumentation.
makes flow meters. I've been doing flow meters since 1976. So
Right, and he's doing like these ultra.
yeah, it's the flow meter for your IV.
Yeah.
And I had the IV stuck. I was doing my own infusions at home. Back in November, I got so sick with this infection. I was doing my own infusions at home, or I could have used one of these things. So I went through the whole. I got first-hand experience with what the visiting nurse does, which comes in to give you the infusion at home rather than putting you in the hospital. No, that has.
Yeah, so what's he up to now?
Oh, no, I've got 34 followers, which is the most number of RVC angels that have ever been interested. So, we're right at the point where we submitted all the due diligence stuff a month ago. But there's this new due diligence process through the RVC. They were all done. They were ready to release their report a week and a half ago. And then I looked at it and I asked one simple question, and that's a week and a half later. I got any answer as to when the report's going to be ready. Because he's going to need the second round of investment. And he's already told everybody what the round was. And I said, well, how do you put that in today's valuation? The need for this more money tomorrow.
One of them, a lot of them don't do this. They actually will, they parse down, we're looking for, say, $200,000 spent on. That's what I kind of wanted you to mention, like what mixture of things would you like to see money spent on? This company had 50% on wages and selling. And I just said, I don't know if that looks good, unless it's direct R&D.
Yeah.
Because I think the investor wants the focus of the money to be into in the market.
So far, $2 million I've raised, there's $1 million. And all that million was being spent on 100%. Okay. We just hired our first sales guy. Started 2 weeks ago.
This is
Just getting ready to start to spend 6 months to get ready, so we can start to sell in 6 months. Because use all that work now to get ready to sell. At that point, once we've got stuff on the marketplace, that's when I'll feel
is when you do another round of financing, there's a lot of complicated old investor, new investor shifting. And you kind of want to like minimize those interactions because they take time.
Yeah, and what's your cap table look like and everything else, but we got an hour. I did all.
I'll let you have it.
Let me just get up. Okay,
Sure that,
well, Roger asked me to cover one extra topic
Okay, go
first,
ahead.
which was when you are looking for investment, one of the questions that comes up is usage of funds and what are appropriate usage of funds for your investment. And I don't have a pat answer for that. It varies a lot depending on the deal. But there are uses of funds that are definite deal killers. If there's a penny going to an old investor, don't bother pitching because you aren't getting funded. If there are old bills that need to be paid, Okay, I'm doing that right now with a company that has 200,000 in past due payables that's looking for investment, of which a bunch of it is salary on the books to the principal that was never paid. Well, of course, without saying anything, that salary is never being paid, it's being written off, it's gone, it's not on the books, okay? Because if it was, okay, he's got also some $40,000 in past due bills to patent attorneys. Okay, that's okay, those can get paid. That's an appropriate use of funds. And for the amount of money he's looking for and the size of the deal and all of that stuff. But for past salary, no. If there's any, it's all gonna be future-oriented stuff. If you're trying to cover past sins by raising this money, it's not gonna happen. Not gonna happen. If you're a little bit in arrears on paying a lawyer, that's no problem. Because if you've dealt with enough lawyers, you know you can stiff them for years.
You have some lawyers that give you credit?
Oh, no, they'll keep you on the books forever, and if they ever think you've ever got any cash, they'll come right after you. But so, yes, once you do get the cash, you will have to pay them, or you will be seeing them in court. But so that, and it depends on so much depends on the type of the deal as to what the appropriate use of funds are, and the stage of the deal. Early stage deals, it's mostly money for R&D. Later stage deals, it mostly should be money for sales and marketing, or growing the company. It really depends where you are on the timeline as you're looking for that money, as to what the appropriate usage of funds are. And so that point you're identifying is where you are on the timeline. Your usage of funds better match everybody's preconceived notions of what the correct usage of funds are. But otherwise, it's pretty freeform how those funds get used. Another red flag is an excessive salary to the founder. That's a deal killer. And what's excessive, again, is excessive in the minds of the investor. And I know guys that are not nutty that will accept all kinds of things in terms of pay for founders. What have I made the last 4 years? In my startup, okay, this much. And when I say what the investment is, well, yeah, my foregone salary's been invested into the company. But no, I'm never expecting to see any money out, and that's why I've got stock. Okay, I'm not gonna get any cash for it, ever.
That's where a company, if you keep talking about a company, you need an investor. Like you said, I'm too old, I'm too late to be retired.
Yeah,
I'm looking to just get the invention, applied for it,
right.
and then license it.
Okay, so licensing is a whole different deal with a whole different set of issues and problems and so on. And you're better off talking to a licensing pro on this, of which I am not one. I don't have much experience in, I mean, I've sold a license. I have sold a license in the past.
Companies that will do that for you, they say they'll do it for you for so much money.
I'd be very skeptical of most of them.
I am, but
Yeah, I'd be very skeptical. I'd say go start talking to people. Go sell it. Go find out what your market is. Do you have traction? Be your own best salesman. Go talk to people.
get the provisional patent first.
Get your provisional filed and then go talk to people. That's the way I do it. In fact, I've done multiple times when I've filed a provisional, then I've gone to talk to people to see if there was any traction. And if there wasn't any traction, drop the provisional.
Or you could, by dropping, just let it run.
Just let it expire. Yeah, yeah. Okay. Questions? Roger?
Well, on the, when you get the capital and you're paying employees, I mean, what's reasonable, like, people get, some sort of hybrid mixture of, say, equity and then.
Sure, okay, so there's the whole part of employee stock options. You should, and there's this myth that employee stock options are really good for retaining the best people. And frankly, if you're trying to get a sales guy, I mean an honest-to-God, close-em sales guy, you're getting them for cash. They are not people that take stock. And you probably don't want, the way I've always put it is, I don't want to offer my sales guys stock ever. I've done it before, and it ended up to being decades of tears. Because most sales guys after 3 years, maybe you want a new one. So, no, you don't, I strongly recommend against giving much in the way of stock options. I could give you my stock option story when I was being asked to leave my company and the importance of appropriate market valuation. So I had, back in 2001, in the crazy times, I had a product I was building for a company that got $6 million in venture capital financing, and then went back to the well and managed to bring in $169 million in venture capital financing. And Goldman Sachs had them valued on the product I had already built. It was in the field and working. They built the sensor piece, and I built all the rest of it, which was a Fabre Pro interferometer for fiber optics, and they were going to sell $250,000 a year at $10,000 each. And everybody had bought their sales projections, and Goldman Sachs had them valued at $6 billion based on comparable deals. And when they got the $170 million, the VCs all said, you can't be reliant on this small company over here to build your electronics. We had a very nice deal. It was all working electronics. Everything was good. They hired 30 people, put them in a clean room. I don't know if you know what a clean room is, but from a patent, put them in a clean room. So they had no access to any of the proprietary information. They gave them 18 months, and in 18 months, these 30 people didn't begin to have the product that me and another guy had built in 12. So they decided that the best next point would be to call me up and ask me if I would leave my own company and join theirs. And they had an employee stock option pool, of which they had 1% left in the employee stock option pool because they'd been around for a couple of years. And they offered me the whole 1%. So I'm sitting in the boardroom talking to the board as they're offering me a $60 million signing bonus, according to Goldman Sachs. So I said, something's wrong here. Nobody does this. This is nutty. So I said, I got to think about this. And they were stunned that I had to think about it at all. And I said, I'll talk to you on Monday, Tuesday. I went home for the weekend. I did my own market analysis. I came back after I'd done my market analysis. No, the market wasn't 250,000 pieces a year. The market was 250 to 2,500 pieces. That's $6 billion valuation. I had more like $6 million valuation. Okay? I was wrong, by the way, on my estimate of the market size. It was actually less than 250 pieces a year. They burnt through their whole $170 million. I never took the job. And ultimately, of all the people they had, 3 people ended up taking the job and the product line to a new company that they took the product for free. They paid $1 for the whole thing, for the assets. They buried all the liabilities. So the importance of employee stock options, they were using that 1% that was supposed to be worth a whole lot of money that I valued at worthless to try to attract me as a key employee for this kind of thing. That's what you're talking about. So your biggest problem you find with the employees is they have no way to value those stock options, especially if it's an engineering employee you're trying to bring in with a good one and you're giving them an employee stock option. They don't know the first thing about valuing stock. They're engineers. And so they end up with either an unrealistic demand as to how much stock they want, or they end up going through 4 companies where they change jobs every year for the better stock options, and they end up never collecting ever. And so it's a real mixed bag, stock options. I've got 20% in my employee stock option pool. Yes, I will spend it appropriately, but that may mean that it never gets spent, it may get held there. How much should you pay people? I'm paying below market rates. Why? Because I picked them. I was their professor. They came to work for less. They wanted to be with a startup. I don't know. If you're overpaying because you need a really good software developer or this or that or the other thing, be very careful. Be very careful with what you're doing with employee pay. Now, I've hired hundreds of people. I got to tell you, I'm awful at it. My success rate in hiring people is about 50%. In that 25% of them, I probably want to get rid of them after the first week. The other 25% won't make it through 6 months, and the other half work out. And I've tried every way imaginable to hiring people, from giving huge tests and 4 interviews to flipping a coin once we threw the dart. I mean, literally. The dart was a better indicator than when we went and did all. It's a really tough thing, hiring the right people for your company. I would tell you, as a startup, you don't have any time to live with mistakes. If you make a mistake in hiring, you need to get the axe out as quickly as possible. You don't have time to mess around. So.
What are some sources for evaluation of feasibility, profitability, market size?
Okay, so how did I do my market evaluation for this job I did not take? Was a fiber optic channel monitor. They were going to have one for dense wavelength division multiplexing. They were going to have one, going to be all throughout the country, everywhere. I said, I don't get it. So I started to figure out, well, what is the real capacity need of fiber optics in the US? Okay, everybody needs 10 megabits a second full-time. That gives you one good audio-visual stream. Everybody needs 10 megabits per second. A line carries this much. I went through and I figured it out. And I figured that, 300 fibers built out to the max with the max carrying capacity could connect everybody in the United States. And you would need one on a segment, maybe every 300 miles, maybe not, something like that. So, the rough number was 3,000 pieces. And how they came up with 250,000, I'll never know. It didn't take any rocket science to work this number out. But it really depends on if it's a consumer good, that gets tough.
What's a source of information that we could go to for our products? In agriculture, we call them an enterprise budget, where there's studies that have been done. It gives you an idea.
Yeah, I know a bunch of the market research company guys. In my old company, when I was doing wireless sensor networks, we spent a lot of money to reach out to the ARC Research and Frost and Sullivan and those guys. I never found anything that they published to be worth the paper it was on.
So where is something that's worth the paper?
Yeah, I found what is valuable is for what every time I went to Google and I did my own back of the envelope calculation of how many people could use something, I think that's been the better thing always. And when I bring those numbers forward, like I say, and I can, you can go online and say employees at risk from silicosis. And you can find that number in Google pretty quickly. It's published by the US government, it's everywhere. Okay, tell you the truth, they say 2 million people. I don't believe it. It's a government, they got a bureaucracy to maintain. They need to make their cushy job cushier. Okay, maybe it's a quarter of that, but it's still a big number of people. And so, you need to use some windage on who's giving you the number and that kind of thing. But I've always found that works. When I go to someone And they asked me, what's the market size? And I can bring out, well, in this paper it says it's this, and I found it in Google somehow. And this paper says it's that, or I did the calculation this way. Everybody is pretty accepting of those numbers. When I say Frost & Sullivan says it's going to be $50 billion in 7 years, nobody believes that number. So, before Google, when I did it, I had to be in-depth knowledge of the marketplace by having people who are out selling or talking to people on the ground, or, you know, I look at the guy the company that I'm doing, I'm the lead investor on, has gone out and found the purchasing agents at the 3 largest hospital chains for this device, who between the 3 of them buy over 1 million of them a year. One of them, and they have a committee about which one they should buy, and one of them is sitting on his advisory board now. Okay, that's unimpeachable market information. Okay, so you need someone that is credible, realistic, or you need a set of numbers that you can take the investors through and carry that calculation through. So if it's something for agriculture and there's, I don't know, 20 million acres of corn that could use this, and I can, you know, there's my total addressable market, and it's a good number, and we're gonna charge this, so this price against that, and then, well, how is it worthwhile to the customer to buy it? Well, he's going to make so much. This is his pain point, and this is how much he's going to make. So when
That's the credibility of that is really what's gonna, without that, there's no sense of talking about
no,
to creditor or,
no, you need to have
I
a,
am a lender, I know what
Yeah.
it looks like from that side.
yeah, you need to have good numbers. So I was doing due diligence for this one company up in Boulder, and the numbers sniffed as being an exponential curve that he pulled out of a function on Excel. And I'm looking at the numbers, and it just smelled that way, and I asked him for any specifics on it, and he could give me nothing in the way of background information. And I got so, after about an hour of probing back and forth, I got so frustrated. I said, so how far up your ass did you reach to grab these numbers? And he looked at me with this shocked look, and then he goes, isn't that what everybody does? No. Needless to say, he's never been financed yet. He's 2 years later. No, you need to have facts and figures that make sense, that you can put through a logical ringer. And everybody knows that it's really hard to come up with the right number. We know it isn't going to be the right thing. Yeah, we know that, but have you done the work so you could say this source says there's this many potential users? This source says there's that many potential users. If we say, if we look at the price point, we're saying, here's the price point, this is what it's going to cost them. If they use it, this is what it's going to save them. Okay, now you've got enough facts and figures that when I ask you what's your sales going to look like, you can give me 3 projections. You can say this is our low adoption rate, this is our high adoption rate, this is our expected adoption rate. And everybody knows there's going to be a wide range on them, but if the plan doesn't make sense at the lowest adoption rate, there's no need to go forward. You know, and so when I bring up my 2 million users of my particle product, that the government would do this, okay, so maybe it's 500,000. Well, 500,000 times $500 is still a really big market. It may not be big enough for the VCs, because it's not $1 billion market, but it's certainly big enough for the angels. The angels are all over it. And yes, I have my lead investor. In fact, my lead investor is threatening to take the whole investment that we're looking for. You know, I may never get around to pitching it, because I'll have done enough pre-pitch work in talking to people that I'm just going to have to make a few phone calls once we're finally ready to go with this thing. But that's what I recommend, is facts and figures on the ground. This is how we estimated the market size. with you know, footnoted sources. This is my source for my numbers.
So if I guess that the market inhabited isn't a conservative estimate.
Yeah. Okay, you keep writing patents. Don't quit your day job.
Have you done anything around crowdfunding at all, or do you know anything about crowdfunding?
So I've heard very mixed reports on crowdfunding. And I would tell you that if you got a Kickstarter, it's a lot of work to have a successful Kickstarter campaign. The people who think you can just throw something up on Kickstarter and be successful, well, there are guys who get lucky, but in any field, there are people who get lucky. But I've heard that it's a lot of work to do a proper Kickstarter type campaign. And you've got to have the right kind of product for crowdfunding. And if you do have both of those things, then it can be a very useful, very valuable way of going forward. For me doing a particle counter, I'm not going to get anybody on Kickstarter interested in it. So it's not a way for me to go forward. From the other standpoint, there are various lists and people where you're putting your company forward to the angel groups. And my basic feeling on that is that it doesn't really work. You need to have the personal contact, and you're better off, but you probably can't pitch just to like the RVC. You probably need to plan on going in a 1,000-mile radius and pitching to every venture club or further, or going to the coasts, or you have to do that because your first time you may get lucky, you may not get lucky. It depends on how quickly you're going to learn, how fast your pitch is going to progress. There's lots and lots of variables as to how to go about it, and a lot of study. I'm all the local angels know me. I'm a co-investor with all of them on something somewhere. So when I go to do it, they're all gonna. It's a different deal. The company that I'm lead investing for, it's the same thing. It's a different deal. But he reached out and found me 9 months before he pitched, to get me lined up as his lead investor so that he would have a champion inside the investor community. So when the first naysaying questions came up, there would be an answerer who was in the room and could answer them right away. That's critically important. I tell you, that's probably the most important single thing you can do, is to have a lead investor before you start to pitch. Probably the people that have done it so far have been successful. If you don't have that lead investor before you go to pitch, then you're relying on somebody in the crowd to step up as your lead investor, and that's luck. And you don't want to leave this to luck. And if there's a room of 20 people and none of them find your thing particularly appealing to them because they're all in different spaces, it's luck, it doesn't work. So.
What about these lending clubs?
Lending club, yeah, don't. There are good uses for them. In fact, if one of the companies, the company that I invested in, which was the old guy who is too old to get funded, is a factor. He's doing online factoring. He will buy your receivables for you for 1.5 points a month, and that is far cheaper money than raising it from an investor. He's charging you 18%, and the investor wants 70%. And that's why I funded him, because I knew I would be looking for receivable money, and the banks won't write me a receivable note. So for borrowing money from the bank, you can forget it. It's just not going to happen. So yes, I recommend P2BI. If you have receivables, at least you can get that funded for you. Get some cash quicker that way, and it's the cheapest source of money out there.
Can you speak a little bit about the SBIR?
Sure, the SBIRs are a funny thing, and it depends. I've done, until recently, all my work's been through the National Science Foundation, because I have a professor who's my partner who has written lots of grants to the National Science Foundation and got them funded. He's studied how to get funded grants. you really need to have, they put out topics for the stuff they're interested in. The DOE does it, the Defense Department does it, the NSF does it. You need to fit in one of their topics, not exactly, but at least peripherally. If you fit in that topic, they are very likely to be very happy if you have an academic and a business guy on your team for the NSF. I'm not so sure, but I think the DOE is the same thing. We've been very successful because we've got me, who's been CEO, started businesses, sold businesses, business guy, and we've got the professor who's been very successful at raising grants. We put the two of us together and we bring in another PhD. I've got multiple other PhDs, and we know how to go about applying for the grants. It's a lot of work to learn how to apply for the grants. When you do it, now you're looking at the grant opportunities come around every 6 months. You can submit your grant application. You'll be 3 months before you hear a word. You'll be 6 months before you get any money. You'll get the first grant, and then that'll last for 6 months. And then you apply again, and you'll be another 6 months to a year before you hear back. And you'll get a second round maybe. About half of the people who get first round funding get second round funding. The good part about this money is it's government money, it's free. I am so addicted to this stuff now, I am the SBIR crack whore. That is not a good thing because there are multiple companies in the local area and actually throughout the country that are, in fact, their business model is to go get SBIR grants. And the local angels anywhere, the VCs anywhere, I mean, I had Elizabeth Krause up at the Impact Angel Group in Boulder, was the one who called SBIR companies crack whores for me. It was the first time I heard this. Well, I've got $2 million in free money. I haven't had to give away anything. It's totally free money. It's awful easy to get addicted to free money. And we have the formula down. Like I said, we know how to do it. If you don't know how to do it, it's a lot harder. If whatever your product or service or whatever it is doesn't fit into one of their research categories, it's tough to get funded. Our thing is a micro-electromechanical system, which has been hot to be funded for the last 15 years and has, when we do an application, we submit 30 written papers as references. It just ticks all their boxes off that they have in the reviewing community. Not to mention, my partner sits on the review committees at the NSF for other grants. So he's also doing the same thing I'm doing. When I see people pitch, I then go to listen to the investors, how they dissect the pitches. Well, it's the same thing for him. He sees how everybody's grant gets dissected and then changes his grant application.
Well, yeah, I had a question. Going back when you were talking about obtaining a lead investor, you have a suggestion on how to do that? Is cold calling or just networking? What's the best way?
For me, I knew after I learned that I needed a lead, which took me a while, but I've been going to the RVC meetings religiously. I see Peter about once a week for the last 2 years, okay? So I'm at all the meetings. I think for me, I would have a tough time finding a lead out of the RVC members, so my lead isn't from them, because the kind of product I do is, I end up being the lead for those kind of products in the RVC. I can't be the lead for my own. But it's networking. You need to know the investors, and that's what I say about the time it takes. The time it takes you to be successful at raising funds is a lot longer than you think. You need to put the time in, and that's calendar time. The guy needs to meet you 6, 8 times, various networking events, and there's all kinds of networking events. For you, there's the meetups, which tend to be more the providers than the financial guys, although I've gone to a few just to wander around, but we tend to not go there very often with investor caps on. So it's networking in a big way, yeah, yeah.
So you've seen so many pitches, like you said, you've seen like 200, you know.
I see 200 a year that are formal pitches.
So how many of those are repeat pitches where you know the company's not going to get funding, and yet you end up seeing them again 6 months later? How does your opinion and your colleagues, do your opinions change when you see them reapplying, or do you kind of like, okay, this guy, he's bad?
It depends on their reputation of the guy. There's been guys who have pitched once, got funded, company failed. Okay, companies fail. He's gone around telling all of the local investors how successful he was and how all his investors were happy. Nothing could be further from the truth. If you talk to any of his investors, they're not happy. Now, if he had not gone around telling everybody his investors were happy, they'd be okay with him raising money a second time. The fact that, you know, failure is a fact of life here. You're going to fail. I mean, get over it. I failed at least 3 times before I got one to stick, and it depends on how you count them. Maybe it was 5 times. But there are ways you can fail that don't impact you negatively at all. In fact, can impact you positively. And there are pitches we see, they come back around and pitch again, generally because there's a new team member. Something significant has changed. So this one that I'm lead investor for is pitched years ago. Got no traction. What's changed? New CEO. Totally different deal.
Yeah, I was going to ask if that's
Yeah.
an appropriate time to come back.
Yep. Very much so on the change in the team, some new team member that filled a gap. It doesn't need to be that we remove somebody, it may be the addition of somebody. Or we got some traction in the marketplace finally. We were out there, we weren't getting traction in the marketplace, we weren't getting traction. All of a sudden, we're starting to sell them. We figured out the magic formula to what we need to do to sell them. Now, okay, there's a reason for you to come back and pitch again. But if it's just, we've already seen this once and nothing's changed and you're pitching it again, you probably won't get the chance to pitch. They won't be accepted to do so. Yeah. Wow, it's quiet.
We learn a lot.
Anyone here have a question about terminology? Paul has mentioned a lot of different things.
What's SBIR?
Small Business Innovative Research. It's money set aside. The government says that whatever money is spent on goods and services by the various departments, a certain percentage must be spent on SBIR. So unlike VCs who can sit on their money for a year if nothing fancy comes by that catches their interest, the government's going to spend their SBIR money, period. Yeah. Okay, so and you see companies that get funded in their first round, and you know they were just funding them because they're going to rank them, stack them, and spend the money till the money's spent, not because they were good ideas. Okay?
Some of those are dollars that are around kind of scientific and things like that, but it's not like retail or whatever.
Yeah, retail, no, it's not an SBIR, yeah.
So they like have a list of very specific things they're looking
They-
for, you have to fit in.
Yeah, I would say it's not that specific, but it's in terms of how the pie is cut. Yeah, the MEMS group is 0.1% of all things being worked on in industry falls into that bucket. And yeah, it's a big bucket, and that's what I do. And so there's a lot of money there for it, a lot of interest, and they want to go do it.
What's the MEMS group?
MEMS is micro electromechanical system. So we use silicon wafer fab techniques to build mechanical things.
So you need a writer, grant writer, how do you find a good one?
there's a lot of people out there that will claim they are, but, you ask for how many grants have you applied for and how many were given? And they'll come up with something like, well, this was a bad project and couldn't work anyways, but I took the mud job, and this was a bad one, it wouldn't work anyway. You know, they'll give you something, but, so the professors at DU, I know all of them, in the electrical engineering department, they submit grants all the time. 80% of them have no idea what they're doing. They finally get lucky and they get a grant. Versus the couple that always have $500,000 a year in grant money. Well, you just look at their track record. How much grant money over what period of time, how consistently?
What are their fees?
I don't know, have any idea. I've never.
You pay them up front, or they take it?
Oh, of course, they're gonna pay you up, you're gonna pay up front, I would assume. You can't, okay, so you go to the SBIR for that money, you can't use any of that money for anything. The limits on what you can use it for are very constrained. Can't use it on anything commercial, it can only be used for R&D. That's why the R is, it's research. And so, now there's the other set of grants, is the Advanced Industries of Colorado grants. That money is freeform, you can use that money for anything. There's not a whole lot of it, but a number of companies that I'm aware of locally that are in the same field I'm in have gotten funded that way.
And that was called what?
The Advanced Industries of Colorado. And again, they have like 12, I forget how many committees they have. They've got various things where they're looking to create jobs locally. And you can use that money for commercialization. It doesn't have to be used for research. So my latest application, some of the money was for inventory, some was for marketing help, some was for space advertising. It was all spent on taking that money and using it for something else. But there is, for that grant, there's a matching funds requirement. You have to have funds from somewhere else. Of course, as it turns out, I can use it in a circle. But the SBIR funds work for the Colorado grant money, which then works for the SBIR Phase 2B. So, you know, once it's how it works. Oh yeah, you've got to write. I write every 6 months. I have to write a report on the grant and show what we've done in the final report, and it's, you know, a 40-page report. And I have program managers that I have to go see once a year, and program managers are actually pretty easy to deal with. Yeah. When you get the SBIR grant, you have put in for travel funds so you can go to the travel. This year we're going, I can't remember where we're going, somewhere, they haven't even told us yet when the exact time or date, but it's next month. I gotta go somewhere to go do a presentation. I have real troubles doing presentations, it won't work well.
Is it common to seek funding for product design and prototyping?
Okay, so today, I would have said 10 years ago, you just needed the idea and you could go get funded. Today, it depends on where your space is, whether you can get funded. Most people need to see a prototype before you're going to get any funding. In fact, most people will, again, depending on the product, you need to be in the marketplace before you'll get funding. So for my SBIR stuff, we had initially had the prototype in the lab funded by other NSF grants. So we had the prototype, we wrote it up, and then we took it to a much higher level of prototype. I wouldn't, you know, in an academic work, if you get one good data point, that's good for 3 years of papers, even if the data point was not really true. So we took this thing that worked once, sort of, and we turned it into something that worked in our Phase 1 grant. We ran 100,000 cycles on it. It worked 100,000 cycles perfectly, which we took it to our next grant, which is now we're trying to get it into the field and, you know, all that kind of thing. But if it's a web startup, they're gonna wanna see prototype, they're gonna wanna see users. They may not need to be paid, but you'll need to be transitioning to paid users with some sort of a beta, something or other. If it's a medical device, that's a different game altogether, because you can't sell medical devices without FDA certification. So you need a whole bunch of money before you can get there. It's a different game entirely for the things that need certification. So each field has its own needs for the investors in that field. And, you know, I can talk about these 3 fields, but there's a lot of fields. The retail stuff I know nothing about, next to nothing about. Yeah.
Are you familiar with any of the National Institute of Health? Right.
NIH has a different deal with how you get grants. I have not followed up on that. I've talked to a few people that are used to getting NIH grants. I really didn't get happy feelings from them when they talked about their granting authority, where the NSF grants, I've never heard anybody that had trouble with their granting authority. So I don't know much about NIH.
So, in a sense, you're saying if you have a retail product, you have to have a prototype and you need a market already to even bring grants? Is that what I'm understanding?
For grants? Yeah, it's no research there. There is none that I know of that you can get for grants. If it's a retail product, it's tough. It's a hard way forward. I've listened to numbers of people who've pitched multiple times retail stuff, including one company that had $1.5 million in sales and never got funded through the RVC. It's tough. But I think you've got to look in a different place. And so if you've got a product and it's working and you've got market traction, the venture investor isn't really looking for that retail product. They're a little bit with high-tech Fitbit kind of things and electronics, but that's a different class of investor, and I'm not really tied into that group at all. But they're out there. It's just not the kind of thing I do. I've been high-tech my whole life, so that's where I go.
Have you ever seen or been involved in any staged investments, and how does the investor?
Okay, so it's quite common to stage the investment. Lots of times we get people coming in that are telling us, well, they're going to ask for 2 years worth of money this year. Well, if you're asking for more than a year's money, don't bother. You're asking for a year's money. As soon as you get the money, you're asking for a year's money again. Okay? But that's basically for the investor to keep you on a short enough leash so that as you're making your benchmarks, you'll get the follow-on funding. And you need to hit your dates. You know, you've got to hit them. And so it's quite common for us to have somebody come in, go to Pitch Academy, do whatever, and we'll ask, well, what's the use of funds? And they'll say, well, I'm looking for 2 years worth of funding. And everybody will be immediately trying to talk them down to 1 year into funding, because that's what's going to work. Anything more than that is not staged funding. And no, it's going to be staged. And so you can think of it as I'm asking for a year's worth of money, and then you should be saying, you will be asked, so you ought to have the answer, how many more rounds of investment are you going to need? What is the size of the round going to be? Who are you going to look for investment from in that round? And so that you have your milestones laid out. I'm going to get to this point, that's when I'm going to get my next tranche of money. Then I'm going to have my next milestone, and that's when I'll get my next tranche of money. And, it's not uncommon for a venture-funded, VC-funded startup to go to Series E rounds of financing these days. And actually there's a tendency now to not go to the public market, but to continue with private financing, because private money is turning out to be cheaper than public money. And so there've been some really big financing rounds in very late-stage companies to prevent them from going public, because they don't want to deal with the hassles of being public.
They don't wanna push for an IPO or?
Well, you go for an IPO, there's so much liquidity sloshing around that as you get into a surer investment, the secondary market has opened up enough for these big billion-dollar startups that you can buy and sell the stock without being public on the secondary market that, is just other VCs selling to other VCs and, or private investors. So there's a tendency now where you see companies not going public in late stages, but remaining private and raising $1 billion or $2 billion by staying private, because there's plenty of piles of cash out there. The availability of money, the amount of money looking for a good home is huge. Okay, there's no lack of it. But like I said, there's about 40 billion in this last year going to startups.
You mentioned ageism.
Yep.
Does that carry over to any other preconceptions VCs or ACs may have about presenters? Because there's been a shift with, like Mark Zuckerberg, for example, wearing hoodies to investor meetings.
Oh yeah.
I mean, how much has that changed and evolved?
I probably get marked down because if it's an investor meeting, I'm wearing a suit. And that's probably a negative, but it's showing my age. I gotta act my age. So, yeah, you need to know, it's like anything. If you're pitching a company, you need to know the audience you're pitching to, and you need to tailor your pitch to that audience. If I'm pitching to the angel investor, I'm pitching one thing. If I'm pitching to the VC, I'm pitching another thing. And if I'm pitching to the impact angel, I'm pitching a third thing. And there's a local guy in town who's great at it and has multiple companies that he's gotten financed that he's involved in, where his pitch can be totally different from Thursday to Friday depending on his audience. Completely different thing. It's just selling in general. Know your audience and pitch it accordingly.
That brings up another question. With your experience, and you did tap into this earlier about the coast.
Yep.
How much do they vary? Like East Coast,
Tons.
Mountain,
Tons.
West Coast?
Tons.
What kind of differences?
I'm an East Coast guy. I went to DU, but I lived in Massachusetts my whole life, up until 5 years ago when I moved back. East Coast is completely different than West Coast. Boulder is completely different than Denver. Okay? It's almost the same as going from the West Coast to the East Coast, except all you got to do is drive down 36. Everybody in Denver investors in Denver are going to be much more facts and figures and dollars. Investors in Boulder are going to be much more, what good is this doing for people? When I go to a Boulder investor meeting, I am quite likely to dress down. When I go to a Denver investment meeting, I'm quite likely to dress up. Not that the people in Denver will be dressed up, but it's just me, and it fits. I've been in investor meetings in Boulder, in a guy in flip-flops with a hole in his t-shirt with paint stains that's funded about 20 different startups. Whatever works. There's very little preconceived stuff. I'd say the ageism and having a blot on your resume where you've lied. Okay, there is no blot on your resume for failure, but there's a huge blot if you're considered to be untrustworthy. That's one you will not overcome. So whatever goes wrong, be honest about it. If you try to paper it over too much, that'll be a blot against you that will go for a long time. You probably won't overcome it. And I've seen this happening numerous times now in some local investing where they've done their due diligence, especially on the background of the team, found some nefarious doings, and it's done. There's 200 deals coming down my pipeline. I don't need to deal with this one. So, but a failure is not a blot. Especially if you learn something and you can tell, if you can say very honestly why you failed, well, that's probably a plus.
You mentioned prototyping and stuff like that. Are there certain companies or individuals where if you're interested in developing a prototype, what would be your next steps?
If I was going to build a prototype, I'd build it myself. I have working prototypes, right. In terms of going to get a prototype built, there's lots of ways to spend lots of money and not get anything. There's endless ways to do that. The first thing you got to do is get an engineer on your team who you're going to put in charge of that. And that's what team is all about. You've got somebody who can deal with it successfully. And having a non-engineer dealing with engineers to get a prototype built is, well, if you're really street smart, it can work out okay, but you got to be really crafty as you write your contracts, where you're paying for performance, not time. And there are tons of development companies out there. I've used them in the past myself, and for projects that I was contracted to build with somebody, and you just don't. You're going to get the least amount of work for the maximum amount of pay, because that's the game. That's the game. So how do I do all my stuff? I do it myself. And do I have, I do electrical products. I've got 5 electrical engineers on staff. Yeah, we can build you anything you need. Roger?
I'm going for my second round of funding.
Yep.
How common is it to go to the same investors again?
You should do that first. But you should know that you're going to need a second round ahead of time. Right. And so that they've been aware that you're going to be looking for a second round later. And that's what P2BI did. They went for their first round. They went right back to the same people for the second round, and they were subscribed. It took a week to hit their initial subscription rate. And they have John Spires as the chairman of the board, who's next gen. He sold his company and then he bought it back and made 60% of the sales price in the process. And is pretty smart that way. Well, they were looking for $1 million and they raised it in a week, so they raised the amount to $1.5 million, and that took about 3 weeks, so they raised it to $2 million. And you should expect to. And from the flip side, the investors who know you're going to come back to the well for more, probably you should have money in reserve for you ahead of time, because if you hit your milestones, you're there. Now, I'm invested in a couple companies that have not hit their milestones, and they've come back to me for more money. And I said, no, you can go find somebody new. So go, and they're having trouble finding somebody new because they didn't hit their milestones. Hit your milestones. Don't make a promise you can't keep. And if something goes, and something's going to go wrong, probably 20 things, and it's always going to take more money and longer time than you expect. And just be honest, this went wrong and that went wrong, and here's where we are.
So when you turn away these investors that were previously funded, obviously they had a concept or idea that you believed in.
Yep.
And perhaps they hit some stumbling blocks. They haven't quite gotten where they wanted to be with their metrics.
Yep.
You're saying, no, I'm not going to invest now. So is that in your best interest to say, no, I don't want to do that?
Sure, it's called cutting my losses.
Well, but if you believe in them, if you think they're going to be
I
successful.
did.
You did? So you're.
I'm saying if you don't hit a milestone, that's a very good reason for me not to believe in you anymore. And you better have a very good story to explain why you missed your milestone. or you better not have given me that milestone in the first place. Because, look, I'm looking for a 10 times return because I'm expecting half of my money is gonna vaporize. Half of those companies I fund are not going anywhere. It's gonna vaporize. It's high-risk stuff. You know, one of them's gonna be an outrageous home run. A couple of them are gonna be good triples, and a couple of them are gonna be base hits, and I might get my money back, and half of them are gonna fail. And my job is to identify the failures as quickly as possible and not throw good money after bad. So if you miss a milestone for me, yeah, I better hear a good reason. I didn't hear a good reason as to why the milestone was missed. I'm not happy. No, somebody else can invest in you.
So you mentioned failures. Do you have any provisions in place to protect you as the AC or VC? Do they have any provisions to protect themselves from a failure?
Oh, sure. If you take my class, we'll spend a whole 2 hours just talking about the language used in term sheets and how a single word that looks innocuous can make you a pauper. Because negotiating term sheets and the jargon they use, and I can write you a term sheet which is one paragraph filled with jargon, which means if anything goes wrong, I own you and your first 3 children. and you know, so but the basic thing to look at there is preferences. Preferences. What are the preferences? Preferences are, I get paid back 3 times my initial investment before anybody else gets paid. Or dilution. If you dilute, I've got a full ratchet on the dilution, which means any dilution comes out of your share, not mine. And that's the terms used. They say full ratchet dilution. You're a first-time entrepreneur. What does that mean? I don't know what it means. It's okay. What it means is if you have a down round, all the money's coming out of my share. All the stock is coming out of my share, not out of the initial investor's share. So there's plenty of terms in a term sheet that can make your whole dream turn to dust in a heartbeat with one missed milestone.
So what's the name of the class that you use?
I teach entrepreneurship for engineers. I don't recommend it for anybody who's a business major. I've got a business background at all. Yeah. I recommend it. It's for engineers who are going to be members of a startup team. And it's just to teach them enough to, it's not for those who are going to be principals, it's just to teach them enough so that when they're not taken advantage of when they're signing that employment contract or, you know, evaluating, is this the team I should join or not, and that kind of thing. Otherwise, you go to the MBA school for the real big stuff, yeah.
Thank you very, very much.
Been a great audience.
Lots of questions.
Lots of good questions.
These are interesting.